Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. February 23, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Death of Louie Spicolli and tons more. By Observer staff. Late Saturday night, Louie Spicolli was at his home in San Pedro, California, a beach town suburb of Los Angeles, hanging out with a few friends watching pro wrestling videos. When they started watching his match against Chris Adams from Nitro 5 nights earlier, his friends started razzing him about this being the start of what appeared to be his biggest career push, and how he had put on so much weight and was looking out of shape. He had stopped going to the gym and he was letting his hair get messy, he explained, because his new WCW character was going to be like Chris Farley. But he told his friends he was worried, because the drug use of some of his coworkers and friends in the company was starting to scare him, and he was no stranger to the pitfalls of drugs. Ultimately, like far too many others in this profession, he was right on. On both accounts, Spicolli was found dead by his friend John Hanna the next morning at about 8:55 a.m. Hanna, who stayed over at his house that night because they were up late watching tapes and he lived so far away, woke up to a really bad odor. When he opened the door to Spicolli's room, he knew right away what had happened. Spicolli was off his bed laying face first on the floor, there was vomit all over the place, his ankles were swollen and his body was already discolored. He had just turned 27 5 days earlier. Spicolli had taken 26 somas, a prescription sleeping pill painkiller that is the drug of choice in the wrestling profession today. The drugs are easily obtainable through noted mark doctors who want to be friends with celebrities, modern-day Tsarians. He combined the pills with drinking a lot of wine, apparently it being the only beverage in the house at the time, while his friends were there. His friends had been worried about his use and actually hid his bottle, but he somehow searched the house and found it and nearly emptied it. While he was noticeably buzzed, they had all seen him in far worse condition in the past as he had built up an incredible tolerance to somas. It was more his normal daily routine to get to sleep and by no means an attempt at suicide. He would take 15 without it even affecting him. He took 25 to 30 somas every night before going to bed, which he felt he needed to sleep, a dosage that would easily hospitalize an average person, but he had built up such a tolerance for it that he'd wake up fresh next morning and go to the gym. For recreation he'd take even more, and after a while he'd lose count, and once he was buzzed he'd pop them indiscriminately. Friends recalled that it wasn't unusual for them to have to bring him to his room and put him to bed when he'd pass out, but on this night, even though he was drinking heavily as well, he was able to get to bed on his own at about 2:30 a.m. Hanna, sleeping in the next room, recalls being momentarily awakened at 4:15 a.m. by Spicolli's heavy snoring, and also recalls the alarm clock going off at 5:10 a.m. and Spicolli reflexively turning it off. Hanna said he never woke up hearing a thud of Spicolli falling off his bed to the floor, or trying to get up and get to the bathroom and collapsing on the floor after vomiting heavily. However, the paramedics were surprised only because the state of the body the next morning indicated he'd been dead a lot longer. Hanna was going to wake Spicolli up to get him ready for an early afternoon flight to Tampa for Nitro the next day. The actual cause of death could not be determined until the full autopsy report came back later in the week, but it was believed to have either been a bad reaction to the combination of alcohol and pills, ironically almost a nightly staple of far too many in the profession despite all the warning signs and deaths in the profession, or choking on his vomit from getting ill from the combination. When the police arrived, they theorized that the wine multiplied the effects of the somas by as much as tenfold. That's a scary bit of math when one considers the percentage of pro wrestlers today who take somas and mix alcohol on a routine basis on the road. Perhaps the tragedy of this, just like the previous tragedy with Brian Pillman, is that it did not shock those who knew him best. While broken up, his parents' reaction was that it was something that was eventually going to happen because he hadn't heeded so many warnings and near misses, and this simply was when it happened. Funeral services were scheduled for February 20th at 9 a.m. at the Mary, Star of the Sea Catholic Church in San Pedro. Spicolli, real name Louie Mucciolo, took his ring name from the character of the always stoned surfer played by Sean Penn in the cult movie classic Fast Times at Ridgemont High. He had been a big wrestling fan from the age of 14. He was enamored with the World Wrestling Federation during its glory days of drawing big houses monthly at the Los Angeles Sports Arena, which he attended religiously from getting interested in wrestling in 1985 during the early days of Hulk Hogan's title reign. There is actually a tape of a teenage Lou Mucciolo at ringside in the crowd on a Saturday night's main event show taped at the Sports Arena in November of 1986. While attending a show at the Sports Arena, he met up with ring announcer Bill Laster, Billy Anderson, and began training with him at a garage in East Los Angeles with the Mexican luchadores when he was just 16 years old. Mucciolo was a good natural athlete, a standout high school pitcher with a great arm who was actually believed to have had great potential, perhaps even pro potential, in that sport. But he never really cared for baseball or school, or anything but wrestling, and dropped out of high school to follow his dream. His natural athletic ability made him pick up things rather quickly, and after just 3 months of training, just a few days after his 17th birthday, Anderson brought him as a jobber to a WWF television taping in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he had his first match putting over Ron Bass. Over the next several years, he worked as a WWF jobber, highly regarded enough that he was used not only on local tapings, but flown to wherever the tapings were being held, and generally considered one of the best jobbers the company had. He continued that for several years on and off, until he basically quit because he knew if he continued any longer he'd be typecast as a jobber, and he may have actually stayed a little long in that role, but even in later years would be brought in as an opponent for certain guys such as Lightning Kid, Not Six, and Latin Fury now Conan, who actually started out his career with him working Tijuana and Southern California independent shows, and dark matches at WWF tapings. He also teamed with Anderson and various third members of a trio as Los Mercenarios Americanos, a main event foreign heel trio, working regularly at Auditorio Municipal in Tijuana, holding a version of the World Trios Championship where he learned to work against Mexican wrestlers. He had used the name Spicolli for so long since starting in wrestling that virtually all his friends and everyone in the wrestling industry knew him by that name. His friends looked up to him as the one in the group who had made it, who was starting to live out his dream, but also feared for him because his drug use was hardly a well-kept secret. In early 1996, while working for the WWF as Rad Radford, after taking about 55 somas, he was found face first in a puddle in the rain in front of a neighbor's house in early 1996 and was rushed to the hospital. He was in life-threatening critical condition for 2 days. At one point he was actually clinically dead for a few minutes, and talked of smelling the cigar smoke of his deceased grandfather before the doctors got his heart started beating again. While he tried to keep the cause of his collapse secret from the WWF, the company must have figured it out, as he was heavy into the somas behind closed doors every night with the boys and at home with his friends. The WWF wanted to get rid of him immediately, eventually after a lot of public haggling back and forth, giving him a full release after initially giving him a restricted release that wouldn't have allowed him to wrestle for World Championship Wrestling for the duration of his WWF contract, even though they were dropping him. He had gotten the WWF job after the WWF hierarchy had seen him on the AAA When Worlds Collide pay-per-view in November 1994 where, through weights, which he didn't really like doing, and steroids, he bulked himself up to 265 pounds, always believing the size would get him a job and push in the WWF from growing up during the 80s. Apparently the WWF had always liked his work, but because of his size, never really considered him as a serious prospect. However, his work, his newfound size and his charisma, doing a silly dance under the ring name Madonna's Boyfriend, a gimmick Antonio Pena came up for him that he at first actually hated but then realized would get him noticed by the WWF, led to a contract offer literally days after the pay-per-view. Of course, there was a little problem in that he was under an existing contract with Ron Skoler, who promoted the AAA shows in the United States and was working as a regular in Mexico as part of Los Gringos Locos with the late Love Machine, Eddie Guerrero, and Conan. Spicolli signed the WWF deal when he still had an existing contract, causing a minor problem, which was eventually rectified when Skoler let him out of his deal. During a tumultuous period literally days after Machine's demise, ironically perhaps being from a bad combination of downers and alcohol, that was the coroner's eventual ruling, but there were also internal signs in the autopsy consistent with steroid deaths, which the coroner ruled about after being told Machine had never used steroids, which in fact was not the case, and right as the economy in Mexico was about to take a major tumble which would have no doubt ended his AAA run anyway, he walked out on the promotion citing that while he liked the wrestling in AAA and being in a top spot, he hated Mexico and never wanted to return. After WWF, he wound up in ECW, largely as a favor called in by Sabu. In 1993, while both were on tour with FMW with Spicolli working under a mask at the White African, apparently Spicolli needed to go to the bathroom while on a lengthy bus ride. The bus driver wouldn't stop, and Sabu apparently told him to piss in a water bottle, which he did, and then threw it out the window. When Atsushi Onita found out about it, he fired Spicolli, and Sabu, since he felt responsible by telling him to do so, felt somewhat beholden to him. At first, Spicolli received something of an undercard push, getting a big Pavlovian pop by coming out to the famous song, Louie, Louie, and being the master of the Death Valley Driver, a move he had seen watching All Japan Women tapes of Atsuko Mita that he pretty well brought to the United States. But the push stalled over a number of both public and private issues. Spicolli's drug use, which he kept secret except from the boys and a few friends in WWF, was becoming more flagrant and even scary. He took as many as 85 somas in one sitting at his worst. It was not unusual both in his WWF and ECW days for him to pass out on airplanes and be taken to emergency rooms to throw it up out of his system, and miss connecting flights and show up late for shows. It became bad enough that Paul Heyman considered it a company embarrassment and feared the potential repercussions. At the same time, Sabu would always back up Spicolli and keep Heyman from getting rid of him. Exactly what happened at this point depends upon whose version one wants to believe. Spicolli, unhappy about his lack of a push in money, he was making about $250 per show, but when Heyman wouldn't give him a raise, Sabu felt bad enough about it that he often would give him another $100 per show out of his own pocket, felt that Heyman was making up stories to make him look bad to Sabu, and thus be able to justify getting rid of him. Heyman said at the time he was mad because Spicolli's ring work wasn't improving and he wasn't attending afternoon training sessions before the show, although privately was scared of a potential problem on his watch. At the same time, with relations worsening between the two, Heyman found out that Spicolli had called Bruce Pritchard of the WWF trying to broker a deal where he, Sabu and Rob Van Dam would all leave for the WWF. This was before the Mr. Monday Night gimmick. Heyman also claimed to have found out from Kevin Sullivan that Spicolli was trying to get into WCW as well. Spicolli readily admitted to the former but denied the latter. Spicolli missing another shot in the midst of all this because he passed out on an airplane didn't help his cause. Finally, according to Spicolli, fed up because he was being buried and his feud with Tommy Dreamer was cut off and he wasn't booked on the company's Hardcore Heaven pay-per-view, he quit after getting word that Terry Taylor was getting him a job with WCW. Heyman claimed he had fired him, although if Spicolli did quit, there is no question it was a quitting desired and manipulated by Heyman because of a fear of what the future might bring, although Spicolli had claimed at the time he was furious at Heyman for telling people that he had fired him when he actually quit. According to Heyman, he fired Spicolli because of his problems and because of Heyman's own fear of having the next wrestling tragedy be in his locker room. Spicolli remained tight with Sabu after leaving ECW and the two talked regularly on the phone, and Sabu was said to have cried nearly the entire flight back from Germany on Sunday night after getting the news. He started with WCW at the Orlando television tapings in August, and that job nearly ended right after it started as well. Just a few weeks later he overdosed on somas again and was hospitalized, but they were again able to get him to throw up and he was released later that day. It was a near miss about WCW finding out about it, as when he was in the hospital Terry Taylor called and was simply told he wasn't home. If Taylor had called a few hours earlier, he would have caught Spicolli in bad enough shape to realize something was up. Spicolli finally took that as a wake-up call and kicked the pills cold turkey for about a week or two until finding out his mother had lymphatic cancer and was only expected to live a few more months. That put him into an emotional tailspin and he started back up. His peer group in WCW made the situation worse as he was stunned to find out just how pervasive use was within the company. He was mainly used as a television wrestler in WCW, in somewhat of a glorified jobber role like one of about 30 other wrestlers the company brought in at about the same time, until getting tight with Scott Hall in particular, and coming up with the idea of being an NWO pledge and something of a Hall gopher, a role that somewhat mirrored what real life had become for him on the road. It was basically a comedy gimmick that he suggested to Hall and Hall went to bat for him on, where he was to be used to put over Larry Zbyszko to keep Hall and Zbyszko's issue going while delaying a second match between the two. 5 days before his death in doing a color routine with Tony Schiavone and Mike Tenay on Nitro, his performance shocked everyone and all of a sudden he became in the plans with talk about making him a regular, perhaps as a comedic heel color commentator and make him somewhat of a mid-level name wrestler in the company. He was brought back on Thunder 3 days later in the same role, where he nearly shot himself in the foot by responding to a line by Schiavone about there being a bombshell later in the show, saying that he shouldn't use the word bombshell in Oklahoma City. Schiavone, who apparently earlier in the day had while sightseeing seen displays and horrific sights of kids dying torturous deaths regarding the famed Oklahoma City bombing, was already broken up and that remark made things worse. Spicolli immediately knew he had screwed up, but other than being told that this wasn't ECW and that wasn't the kind of a line you can get away with, wasn't given any indication there would be any serious problems stemming from the line and it would be chalked it up to bad judgment. Aside from that, he was in really good spirits regarding his career coming off his performance on Nitro, and had brought both his mother and his grandmother, who actually raised him after his parents divorced when he was very young, to the Thunder taping to introduce them to his celebrity co-workers. And so it happens on another Sunday. And by Monday everyone gets the word, gets sad for a few minutes, and goes about their daily lives. Another fantasy character has left the territory, never to return again. Hardly the first. Certainly not the last. People within the business have known for the past few years that problems with prescription painkillers had become the most lethal potential problem facing the business. While not eliminated, cocaine use has apparently declined greatly from its peak in the business in the 80s, and steroid use has declined from its peak in the late 80s and early 90s. But this problem is another one without an easy solution. Even if management and the companies acted with everyone's health as its first priority, how do you stop usage of a drug prescribed for pain or sleeping aid by a doctor that wrestlers have easy access to abusive amounts of? It's even ridiculous to think you could have pro wrestling, or any contact sport for that matter, without occasional or even regular use of prescription pain pills. Forget about the insane bumps and stunts. Even normal physical wear and tear from jumping up and down and knocking heads, so to speak, in a contact sport is going to bring aches and pains, and years of doing so is going to bring constant pain. It goes with the territory. In other words, to an extent, some problems are unavoidable. But not at this level. Other contact sports are just as brutal, and the players are under even more scrutiny and pressure to perform. Addictions to painkillers exist, such as was celebrated nationally with Brett Favre. But you just don't see the frequency of deaths in those sports. With the exception of rock stars, professional bodybuilders and race car drivers, I doubt there is an sport or entertainment profession with a higher mortality rate than pro wrestlers. Boxers may die in the ring with far more frequency, but hardly as many die out of the ring at such young ages. Sure, someone will bring up Len Bias in basketball, but what was that, 10 or 15 years ago? The number of deaths of active pro wrestlers since Len Bias from causes in some form related to drug use is lengthy enough that nobody could even tally a list without leaving a half dozen out. Drug testing is not the answer, but with as many drug deaths as there have been in this profession, eliminating drug testing, or exactly what the current drug testing systems are or aren't, is even less of an answer. We talked about the limitations of such programs, but it's ridiculous that companies have all but dropped their drug programs as anything more than occasional lip service. There are wrestlers, some of whom have past well-chronicled drug histories, that reportedly actually have it in their contracts, or at least has verbal agreements that they can't be drug tested, which shows what the real bottom line on this issue really is. To the best of my knowledge, the WWF has in recent months drug tested 1 or 2 wrestlers, one of which was Brian Pillman, who wound up dead a few weeks later. One major star was recently in rehab. WCW had a well-publicized situation with Scott Hall in rehab last year. Steroid use, now that it's no longer a hot media topic, is ignored, as wouldn't one think testing for reasonable cause with steroid use banned would include wrestlers with physiques that are so bloated they look like they're ready to explode, combined with mountains of acne on their back, not to mention a few, not just men, who have physiques that people who don't even go on the road couldn't achieve drug-free, let alone those who are on the road for the better part of their lives. This is not a WWF problem or a WCW problem or an ECW problem, it is an industry-wide problem. The steroid policy in WCW internally by the wrestlers is considered a complete joke there as well. ECW has no policy at all, with Paul Heyman's claim always being that he didn't care what guys did on their own time as long as it wasn't out of hand and then they showed up for work able to perform. Shortly after Pillman's death, WCW tested about a dozen or so undercard wrestlers, about 28% of whom came up positive, largely for either marijuana or steroids. There were no suspensions, as WCW policy is for them to attend an educational class on first offense. But wouldn't such a high percentage of positives indicate a company with some serious problems, and almost demand full-scale regular testing to make an attempt to get it under control? Maybe some undercard guys will be tested again, since one of the wrestlers that died this time was under contract to Turner. Maybe they won't. For WWF and WCW on Monday, the day after the latest business tragedy, it was business as usual. A silly little thing like a prelim wrestler croaking can't get in the way of planning high-pressure television shows. And we all know that the show must go on, and anyone who is going to be successful in any business can't spend their lives dwelling on negatives that have already happened. But is ignoring them any less dangerous? The mood in Tampa at Nitro was said to be one of surprise, some sadness, and mostly business. The company did put up a graphic with a picture when the show started indicating that Spicolli had died, but aside from the incredibly poor judgment of having Zbyszko, who Spicolli was feuding with, have the death brought up to him so he could stay in character and basically blow it off with no explanation to a viewing audience of millions that had to be at least somewhat curious. Nobody said a word about it, and that graphic had to leave everyone curious as hell. There was the NWO, Hall in particular, who had been palling around with Spicolli both on TV and off, not even allowed to say a word. There was Bret Hart, Spicolli's wrestling idol, not allowed to say a word. There was Mike Tenay, who had known Spicolli well for years, never acknowledging the death of someone who literally over the previous 7 days had become a storyline character. Reality, even the harshest kind, can't creep into wrestling television, particularly when a record rating is being gunned for. For all of the bad judgment, or callousness to garner a rating, and you can take your pick of how to judge Vince McMahon's decision-making under the pressure of the Pillman death, one can't say he ran away from the subject, either the death or the possible involvement of drugs in Pillman's demise, on his television. He approached it. Some would say callously exploited it. Maybe simply made a bad call under enormous pressure. But he didn't run from it. And they did ban so-called mark doctors from their dressing rooms. It's not an answer to the problem, but it does make contact with such doctors more of a mild annoyance. But any wrestler worth their salt in any city knows how and where they can easily get almost anything they want. And Bischoff did 1 week later plead with any of his wrestlers that have a problem to let him know and he'd get them help for it and it wouldn't negatively affect their position with the company. WCW certainly didn't exploit it. There was no way they would, as the last thing was a lesson everyone learned from. But they did appear to run from it. At least they didn't try and make an angle and try to draw money from it. It almost sounds like a damned if you do and damned if you don't reaction to the promotions in the television handling of these tragedies. But I don't believe it to be that complicated. If it was the NFL or the NBA or MLB and a player, whether he be a star or a backup player on a team with a nationally televised game, had been found dead that day or 1 day before, how would the promotion handle it? They wouldn't tease throughout the show for ratings purposes that their widow would be on doing an interview. Nor would they instruct all the players ahead of time that if they are interviewed before or after the game, never to mention the incident ever happened, and have the lone reference be by a player on the opposite team basically saying out of respect for his family that he wasn't going to say anything and have it never be brought up again the rest of the game, nor would pertinent information that the audience watching is curious be ignored on the broadcast. It's really not all that complicated to handle it respectfully and professionally, except somehow it doesn't happen that way in this profession much of the time. In the past few months, the sport of collegiate wrestling has a major scandal of its own. 3 different wrestlers passed away while dehydrating themselves cutting weight prior to early season meets. College wrestlers had drastically cut weight as standard operating practice for decades, with occasional dizziness and dehydration but never with fatal consequences. The difference was theorized, but not yet proven, as being a bodybuilding supplement called creatine, which has become popular in the last few years, which retains water in the muscles and has been scientifically proven to add slight increases in strength and lean muscle mass. By itself, creatine may not even be dangerous. But in combination with cutting weight and perhaps usage of diuretics to lose temporary water weight to make a weigh-in, the creatine keeping water in the muscles may result in a loss of water for the internal organs, resulting in organs shutting down and death. College wrestling responded to this black eye immediately, drastically changing rules as to how much weight a wrestler could cut and changing the time of weigh-ins, basically changing protocol enough that the problem should be not be slightly curtailed, but actually should be totally eliminated. In the past 13 years, pro wrestling, which has far fewer people involved in its ranks than all the collegiate wrestling programs in America, has had 17 major deaths that could be loosely related to problems with drugs or alcohol and countless others that would probably also fall into that category that were on the fringe of the business and thus their deaths went virtually unnoticed. Will anyone learn a lesson from this one? The previous 16 didn't seem to make a hell of a lot of difference to so many in the profession. One person very close to both pro wrestling and to major sports noted to me that legitimate sports have drug problems, maybe not quite as pervasive or as serious, but the difference is far more athletes in regular sports go into rehab, while far more athletes in pro wrestling don't. And far more die. If this happened in the NFL or the NBA with this kind of frequency, you could only imagine the media outcry. With pro wrestling, it's a few minutes of sadness, worrying about what Phil Mushnick will write about it, figuring nobody else in the mainstream media will care and it'll then go away, and frantically trying to put together Monday night's television show. For some reason they never count. Maybe because they are often fake characters with fake names that are never discussed mainstream except within the restricted confines of their television shows. And to those who do take things more seriously, Pillman was made into almost a posthumous cult hero like a fallen rock star, while people failed to address or acknowledge the reality that the pressures of the business, some of which were self-imposed, in a sense killed him, nor was there any demand in his wake for a more seriously imposed drug testing program. Maybe they didn't care enough. Maybe they were smart enough to realize that any drug testing with the program administered by those within the pro wrestling organization only has as much credibility as those who run the organizations have. You know, stars only seem to test positive the day they give notice to leave to the rival group. While everyone was forced to acknowledge Pillman wasn't a fantasy maniac and that he left a wife and 6 children behind, it wound up being only a temporary detour from the fantasy before he was put on a Jim Morrison-like pedestal. Everyone breathed easy about it being some sort of congenital heart problem, symbolizing that it really was unavoidable and it wasn't the business, and it really wasn't the drugs that were the culprit. But that's a fraud and everyone close to the situation deep down knows it. Spicolli, well, he wasn't a big star. But some people have to answer the very ugly question. Why was he getting a push now? Sure, he kept coming up with ideas to break out of the jobber pack and eventually they used one. But that's not the real answer. The next guy won't count, because odds are he'll probably be in an independent promotion so the mainstream fans won't have ever heard of him. So everyone will just go on and hope then when the next roll of the dice comes in, it'll be on someone else's watch. But knowing full well it is just a roll of the dice. When police arrived at the scene of the death, they were stunned at the quantity of pills legally prescribed to him by a real doctor. But even if that wasn't the case, what is to stop a wrestler, who in some form or fashion is always legitimately injured and in some pain, from going to, say 4 different doctors in 4 different cities, complaining of the same ailment, and get 4 times what would be considered a self-medical dose and use the drugs more for partying than for what they supposedly were intended for? And if they're drug tested, they've got the prescription. So it's a judgment call in a business that often lacks judgment. Like in the mid-80s, for the big boys, there is real big money involved. The stars have almost carte blanche to do what they want when they want. The schedule isn't quite as insane, but the work itself, at least for the ones who take great pride in their work, is more physically demanding. Serious knee injuries are an accepted part of football. Serious back and shoulder injuries are an accepted part of weightlifting. Occasional deaths while in competition are an accepted part of boxing and auto racing. A perverted level of drug abuse is an acceptable part of professional bodybuilding. Serious injuries will and always have been an acceptable part of pro wrestling. But if you were looking in from the outside, you'd be in horror at a profession where the death of a 27-year-old has become almost acceptably routine. In timing that is being considered by many as easily predictable, WWF champion Shawn Michaels was diagnosed on February 11th, or just 4 days before the WWF pay-per-view, as having 2 herniated discs in his lower back, supposedly aggravated by weight training the previous day. The timing of the injury was notable because it came just 2 days to the 1-year mark from his announcement on a live television show where he was scheduled to drop his belt of an apparent career-ending knee injury last year that kept him out of doing jobs for both Psychos set to lose the title and to hated rival Bret Hart at WrestleMania. Since that time, Michaels has captured 2 more titles and avoided doing every job in his path while working as a headliner in a singles match, although he has done a few in tag team matches. The injury, stemming at first from the first major bump he took over the top rope with his back cracking on a casket at ringside at the Royal Rumble in San Jose, had kept him out of action to this point, and the February 15th pay-per-view was scheduled to be his only appearance in the ring before WrestleMania. Michaels was treated with cortisone shots to alleviate the problem and told to stay bedridden for at least 1 week after being kept at San Antonio Methodist Hospital overnight for treatment and being released the next day. The injuries didn't even allow Michaels to travel to the pay-per-view in nearby Houston, nor the television tapings in Dallas and Waco. The WWF released the news that Michaels would most likely not be appearing on the pay-per-view almost immediately on its hotline, and also acknowledged it by Friday in the Houston market and on its Superstars national television show the morning of the pay-per-view show. They did not release his replacement in the match, teasing a surprise right until Savio Vega got into the ring to a groaning audience. Michaels is expected to appear on the WWF's Live Raw telecast on March 2nd in Cleveland along with Mike Tyson. And it was considered almost a definite that he would be appearing for his planned title loss to Steve Austin at WrestleMania. There was a chance that if the cortisone didn't alleviate the problem, the next option would be back surgery, which would put WrestleMania out of the question, but the belief was the odds were strongly against that happening. While this lineup is not known to be official, it is believed the WrestleMania lineup on March 29th in Boston at the Fleet Center will wind up being something very closely approximating this. Michaels vs. Austin for the WWF title with Tyson as a referee outside the ring. Undertaker vs. Kane. Rocky Maivia vs. Ken Shamrock for the IC title. New Age Outlaws vs. Chainsaw Charlie and Cactus Jack for the WWF tag titles in some form of a gimmick match. Owen Hart vs. Hunter Hearst Helmsley for the European title. Taka Michinoku vs. Aguila for the light heavyweight title. Perhaps one more singles match involving the NWA angle, maybe Barry Windham vs. Bradshaw. And, basically in a morale-boosting move to allow everyone to share in on the big WrestleMania payoff, a 15-team, 30-man tag team battle royal using basically all the roster players not otherwise booked on the show. With the showstopper having been stopped, the WWF instead started teasing the dreaded mystery partner angle to take his place for the main event at the February 15th No Way Out of Texas pay-per-view from the Compaq Center, formerly the Summit, in Houston, breaking a WWF record for that city with 16,110 fans, 14,280 paying $241,992 with an incredible $166,343 in merchandise, and selling out more than 1 week in advance. The company's lack of talent depth was exposed once again with a poor undercard, and a main event promise surprise that fizzled, which to a lot of people killed what was an entertaining match before it ever started. As something of a consolation prize for the fans given the change, with Michaels, who no doubt was expected to carry the match and logically provide a memorable ending, out of the picture, they turned it into an ECW/FMW style garbage match, announcing the afternoon of the show that it would be a non-sanctioned no DQ match, and the wrestlers used garbage can lids, chairs and tables to make up for the limitations of the various main eventers. The result was a good finale, but the match, like the show, when over, meant almost nothing. While we don't know the planned main event finish for certain, WWF booking of late has usually been logical except when certain egos get in the way, and the logical finish to set up WrestleMania and give the show itself something of a purpose would have been for Steve Austin to pin Michaels clean. With no Michaels, there was no finish that was going to have that kind of impact, so the pay-per-view main event wound up having no storyline purpose. It was surprising that with Mike Tyson not appearing as was teased on television at one point and Michaels being off at the last minute, that the WWF didn't bring back Undertaker to at least use the card as a strong transition to WrestleMania as opposed to just a Sunday house show, some of which could be saved on tape and used by future societies to torture war criminals and in turns into making confessions. 1. The Headbangers, Glenn Ruth and Charles Warrington, beat off Goldust, Dustin Runnels, and Mark Merrow in 1354. When the match started, Sable and Luna were about to go at it when Merrow ordered Sable to the back. Thrasher, who was injured in St. Louis 1 week earlier, at times seemed to favor his right leg. They mainly got heat on him after Goldust pulled down the ropes and he took a backward bump over the top. Goldust dropped him head first on the ring steps and he juiced. Luna was beating on him at will. Finally, as Merrow set up his TKO, Thrasher revered it into a DDT and started a comeback. As he was on the top rope to set up his finisher, Luna swept his leg and he crotched himself. At this point Merrow gave Mosh the TKO while Sable came storming down the aisle. Instead of going for the win, Merrow jumped out of the ring to keep Sable from going after Luna and we had a pull apart. While this was going on, Thrasher pinned Merrow with an inside cradle. They continued working a pull apart with the two women after the match until Goldust and Luna left. Merrow and Sable argued in the ring until Sable shoved Merrow down. Match itself was okay. 1.5 star. 2. Takamichinoku, Takao Yoshida, pinned Pantera, Javier Posas, to retain the WWF Light Heavyweight title in 10-11. Brian Christopher came out for color commentary. There was some great flying and Pantera did some cool holds, but the actual working with each other and timing of when to do the moves in this match was below par, as they seemed to be rushing from spot to spot, particularly at the finish, to get every move in a prescribed time rather than pace it well. Pantera opened with a great running flip dive over the top. Michinoku came back with his patented running springboard plancha. The match had no heat, but that was expected going in since the light heavyweights are treated as a secondary afterthought. Pantera did a flying ankle scissors off the top rope to the floor and followed with a running tope from the apron through 2 sets of ropes to the floor. Pantera then began working over Michinoku's back rather well, including a double arm backbreaker, a camel clutch and La Tapatia, Rito Romero special, upside down surfboard, and other unique moves to work the back. Pantera then did a Super Astro style running dive into a headbutt on the floor to Michinoku's back. After an elbow off the top, he did a Super Frankensteiner which was somewhat sloppy. He hit a moonsault, but missed a second one. Michinoku got up, not selling any of the previous work, with a knee off the top rope to the back, and teased the Michinoku driver too, but Pantera turned it into a cradle and then into La Magistral for near falls. Michinoku turned and attempted Hurricane Rana into a Liger bomb and hit his springboard dropkick to the back before getting the Michinoku driver 2 for the fall. The match reads a lot better than it was. After the match, Michinoku did a plancha over the post onto both Christopher and Jerry Lawler. 2¼ stars. 3. Godwins, Mark Canterbury and Dennis Knight, beat Quebecers, Jacques Rougeau Jr. and Carl Ouellet in 11:14. This is actually going to wind up being the most famous match on the card because they are going to end up having a Supreme Court fight over it in California over whether or not forcing criminals to watch tapes over and over of this match constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. But who would have ever thought Jacques would do a plancha? Henry clotheslined Pierre from the apron and Phineas pinned him. After the match, the Godwins clocked both with their slop buckets. If after a performance like this, the Quebecers are still major heroes and drawing cards in Montreal, then nothing will ever kill wrestling in that city. -1¼ star. 4. The wrestler formerly with a first name Bradshaw, Don Leafield, beat Jeff Jarrett via DQ in 8:59, so Jarrett retained his NWA North American title. Jim Ross said this match was historic because it was the first time an NWA title had ever been defended on a WWF pay-per-view event. Lawler even talked about Paul Bosch, the legendary promoter in Houston from the mid-60s to late 80s, promoting NWA matches in this city for so many years. While that bit of trivia is correct, it's hard to call a match historic that was forgotten about even while it was going on. Rock and Roll Express and Barry Windham came out with Cornette and Jarrett, but everyone but Cornette was ordered to the back. They are trying to make Bradshaw into Stan Hansen, right down to the ring entrance with the bull rope and the ultra-stiff offense. But the crowd was dead. Most of the match consisted of Cornette and Jarrett working on Bradshaw's bad knee. Finally, Bradshaw made the comeback by catching Jarrett's crossbody and turning it into a fallaway slam. After a power bomb, Bradshaw then slingshotted Cornette into the ring and Cornette dropped his racket. He whipped the two into each other, allowing Cornette to take his 1980s manager pratfall. Jarrett then clocked Bradshaw with the racket for the DQ. After the match, Bradshaw made his own comeback, cleaning up on both until Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson showed up to also take bumps for him. Finally, Barry Windham came out and they were cleaning house on him until the Legion of Doom made the save. 1/2 star. 5. Ken Shamrock and Ahmed Johnson, Tony Norris and Chains, Brian Harris and Skull, Don Harris, and 8-Ball, Ron Harris beat Farouk, Ron Simmons, and Rocky Maivia, Dwayne Johnson, and Mark Henry and D'Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, and Kama Mustafa, Charles Wright, in 13:46. This was a fast-paced all-action match that was somewhat unwieldy in spots. Maivia showed a near superstar-level performance and Shamrock's work is improving as well. Actually, neither Henry or Johnson, who figured to stink up the match, looked all that bad, although they were only kept in the match in small increments. Brown looked good as well, and Skull and 8-Ball looked bad. Ross called Henry the world's strongest drug-free athlete. Don't even know what to make of that statement, although Henry did win a major drug-free powerlifting meet a few years ago, where it is routine for most of the competitors to be on drugs, although in Henry's days as a weightlifter he was always marketed to the public as being drug-free in a drug sport. Then again, most competitors in sports like powerlifting and bodybuilding laugh at claims of people who compete at the top level and claim publicly to be drug-free. There was a big pop when Johnson slammed Henry. Brown at one point flew 3/4 of the way across the ring doing a frog splash on Johnson. Match got ugly in the middle when DOA carried the load. While it was teased before the match in an interview where Rocky grabbed the mic from Farouk and started blabbing, during the match they didn't work the dissension gimmick, saving it for the finish. Finally it turned into a 10-way, and Shamrock used a belly-to-belly, a Fujiwara armbar and switching to an ankle lock to make Maivia tap out, to set up their IC title match at WrestleMania. Maivia blamed Farouk for the loss and actually slapped him. Farouk got mad and instinctively punched Brown, so everyone was at each other's throats and Maivia walked off on his own first, until finally Farouk ordered everyone back in the ring and they did the salute. 2¼ stars. 6. Kane, Glenn Jacobs, pinned Vader, Leon White, in 10:59. Vader did about as good a job as you could do under the circumstances. Mankind was a better match, but that's because Mankind's style is more conducive to working with a monster since Vader can't and shouldn't take those kind of bumps for his character. Mainly a brawl and there were enough twists to keep it entertaining, although it never had much heat. Vader threw some very stiff blows at Kane. He splashed him and even moonsaulted him and then posed for the crowd while Kane sat up. Vader then got a fire extinguisher from under the ring and kept spraying it at Kane. Finally he delivered a power bomb, but again Kane sat up and eventually used a choke slam and a tombstone. Vader noticeably tried to jump so high it looked like he was trying to dunk a basketball in going up for the slam, but at least Kane had him under control the whole way and there was no danger in the move. After the match Kane went under the ring and took a giant wrench and clocked Vader with it. This was an angle to set up Vader actually being out of action due to needing eye surgery, as a plate he had to protect his eye stemming from injuries in the famous Stan Hansen match at the Tokyo Dome was jarred loose, perhaps in the television angle. Vader was carried out of the ring to sell the angle. 1 3/4 stars. 7. Steve Austin, Steve Williams, and Chainsaw Charlie, Terry Funk, and Cactus Jack, Michael Foley, and Owen Heartbeat Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, and Billy Gunn, Monty Sop, and Jesse Jam, Brian James, and Savio Vega, Juan Rivera, in 1741. The crowd booed heavily, and not booing as good heat but groaning, when Vega came out with mystery partner that had been built up throughout the show. It was a wild brawl. Austin clocked everyone with a garbage can lid. He broke a broom handle on Helmsley. Hard chair shots. Basic FMW/ECW style, although really not as good as most FMW main events of the same style. The work was better than most ECW bouts of the same style, but there were none of the memorable psychotic spots that people remember and leave an impact. Jean power bombed Charlie through 2 chairs. Gunn pile drove him on a garbage can lid. Austin threw a garbage can at Gunn's face. Jean gave Charlie a back suplex on the can lid. Helmsley's knee at one point appeared to give out. He then hit Charlie with a chair twice and Charlie fell off the apron onto a table. Finally he made the hot tag to Jack, who had the claw on both Outlaws until Helmsley broke it with a low blow. Jack did his trademark running clothesline where both go over the top, but while on the floor, Gunn DDT'd him. Threw the ring steps on his head and Vega wrapped him up in barbed wire, including putting it in his mouth. Everyone began destroying Jack with a chair until Gunn accidentally hit Jean with a chair when Jack moved. Jack made the hot tag to Austin, who looked really good for his ending flurry, ending up using the stunner on Jean for the pin. After the match he gave another stunner to Gunn, and kicked Helmsley off the apron. Chyna then shoved him twice and flipped him off, and he finally kicked Chyna and gave her the stunner as well for the final big pop. 3 1/2 stars. During the show, the WWF also unveiled 2 different Barker Channel commercials for WrestleMania. The commercials were highly misleading, to say the least. A shorter commercial focuses solely on Mike Tyson, showing boxing footage and saying that Mike Tyson returns to the ring at WrestleMania. The impression given from the commercial is that Tyson will have a boxing match there. The second longer commercial, while not mentioning any other names being on the show besides Tyson, did at least show a lot of wrestling clips with Austin, Michaels, Undertaker and Kane with the same language about Tyson returning to the ring and showing lots of boxing footage of him. That commercial gives the impression that it is a pro wrestling show at least, and that Tyson would either be participating in a boxing or a wrestling match. The commercials certainly are done to give one the impression Tyson is a participant in the main event and not simply an outside the ring referee just being set up for a gimmick spot or two. Speaking of Tyson, he had a meeting on December 12th at the WWF offices in Stamford, Connecticut to go over his future plans. Exactly what took place at the meeting isn't clear at press time, but I'd assume they finalized the angles for pre-WrestleMania and for whatever the WrestleMania angle will be to lead to a possible return appearance that, from the sounds of things, is somewhat likely. I suspect there was also some discussion about Titan getting involved with Tyson's boxing career and image manipulation and more image rehabilitation when he's allowed back in that sport. Quarter-hour breakdowns. There were a few bugs in the system, so to speak, when we started breaking down the ratings and who meant the most of the ratings. In late 1997, with the schedule of Nitro and Raw, there were 2 spots, one in each show, where there were artificial highs and lows. The so-called death spot was at 9 p.m. when Raw started, and for the matter, so did Monday Night Football, and Nitro every week lost a chunk of audience to both competitive shows. A wrestler in that time slot would get blasted. The other artificial high spot was for WWF, which was when Nitro went off the air, most weeks, and this didn't happen every week. Raw gained audience in whatever quarter hour that was, so it made whomever was on television during that time look to be bigger drawing powers than they really were. Even given all that, for the fall of 1997, it was consistent that the biggest ratings boosters were Steve Austin for WWF and Ric Flair for WCW. And far and away the biggest drop in the ratings of any single person was survey says. And even though there were flaws in the system, those flaws wouldn't have changed those overall outcomes, as Austin was rarely in the hot spot and Flair actually was in the death spot several times, so his numbers were actually artificially lower than his actual ratings power, and that in reality he meant more to ratings than anyone, including Austin, for the final quarter of 1997. WCW has actually partially removed those flaws in the system by going 3 hours. We're removing the rest of the flaws by not considering the first hour of Nitro, where it goes unopposed, and where the rating will naturally rise, although it doesn't always until 9 p.m. when the competition starts. So we've started from scratch on January 26th, and aren't including the February 16th show since it wasn't a competitive situation. We don't take Thunder or WCW Saturday Night into account for that same reason. 3 weeks isn't really a long enough period to establish long-term trends, but for now it's a start, and they should be viewed similar to batting averages in baseball 3 weeks into the season, where there are a lot of strange numbers that as time go on eventually fall into a normal pattern, which is what will eventually happen here. And we've also added another system, and that is the margin of difference in the ratings when that particular person is the key part of a segment. The original pluses and minuses signify how much the rating either went up or dropped when that person was on the air. The new system measures the margin of difference between the Raw and Nitro rating when that person is on the air. Where most TV time, the third category is important, is that the people with the most air time should be the highest pluses since they've got more time to garner positive ratings points, and because they shouldn't be given the most television time unless they are able to produce the most points. As you can see, up to this point, that hasn't been the case. Up to this point, of the guys who are pushed the hardest on television, the ones who have carried the ball so to speak more than they've dropped the ball up to this point would be Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Steve Austin, Chainsaw Charlie, Cactus Jack and New Age Outlaws, and the ones who haven't would be Scott Hall, Lex Luger, Kevin Nash, Booker T, Shawn Michaels, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Jeff Jarrett, and Barry Windham. Ratings gap. Because WCW wins handily in virtually every quarter hour, you can't compare WWF and WCW wrestlers against each other in this category. Whereas the previous system, you can compare wrestlers against wrestlers from other companies because the level of viewing is established in the first quarter hour, which isn't considered in the previous system, and the ups and downs from the established level are what is being considered. The only wrestlers listed here are those which were the focal part of at least 2 segments over the past 3 weeks, and those in the first hour of Nitro are again not included because there is no comparison to be made, and what is listed in the average ratings margin when they are out there, not total margin, since total margin would favor the wrestlers who have the most television time. During the 3-week period that we are covering, during the head-to-head 2-hour periods, Nitro averages a 4.61 rating and Raw a 3.38, which means the typical margin of difference is 1.23. In other words, anyone in WCW above a 1.23 is doing better than the company average and below is doing worse. And in WWF, it's the same deal. In comparing these numbers with the aforementioned numbers, the numbers up top actually chart how much ratings gained and fell when the particular person was on the air. The numbers below measure the average ratings gap between Raw and Nitro when the person was on the air, so over the long haul I'd go with the first set as more indicative of reality, because things like how good the show is doing overall and what is being hyped for later in the show is a major factor in the numbers underneath, but not nearly as important in the numbers above. Puerto Rico. The most recent lineup we have would be for a show on February 7th in Manatí with Ray Gonzalez versus Fidel Sierra for the vacant Universal title, held up after a match between the two on January 31st in Gurabo. Carlos Colon versus El Solitario, obviously not the original as he's been dead for 14 years, but area wrestler El Bronco under a new mask, who lost a loser must retire match to Colon in 1996, and Invader No. 1 versus Aki Malumba, Benjamin Peacock better known as Giant Kimala 2 in All Japan. Colon already unmasked Solitario once, revealing a second mask underneath. As part of the gimmick, the heels are claiming but the faces aren't buying it that Solitario is actually a deaf mute, therefore couldn't be Bronco. Villano III held the Puerto Rican title at the time he was deported. Dutch Mantle left after the January 25th show. Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr. were both originally announced for a January 31st house show in Bayamon, with Conan main eventing challenging Gonzalez for the Universal title and Mysterio Jr. facing Villano III for the Puerto Rican title. Their appearances and the entire show were later cancelled. Wale has quit the promotion, and it was reported on television that he was owed $5,000 in back pay, which caused him to quit. Sean Morley was announced on television as returning, but apparently he's also owed money and didn't return. Supposedly he was being advertised before even being consulted with about a possible return. The WWC is being run by Victor Jovica, although the ownership breakdown is Jovica owning 45%, Colon owning 35%, Invader owning 5% and Victor Quiñones owning 15%. However, Quiñones has been on bad terms with the office for years, and while he still owns his stock, has no involvement with the group. Chicky Star and Jose Estrada Sr., the WWF prelim wrestler from the late 70s and early 80s whose son is one of Los Boricuas and whose other son is WWC manager Rico Suave, are the top stars of rival promotion hottest stars of wrestling. Mexico. The February 13th show in Tijuana drew 4,000 with the promo Azteca vs. EMLL main event of Conan and Psicosis and Villano 5 beating Cien Caras and Negro Casas and El Hijo del Santo in the main event when Conan pinned Caras after a low blow. The Azteca team worked as total heels even though Caras and Santo are actually heels within their own promotion. It's funny the difference in Mexico between television and the live show. Santo is a heel on television, but he's by far right now the most popular wrestler in Tijuana since he's worked as the ultra face in the city at live shows. Conan is a big face on television, but since he turned heel at his last two house shows, he was booed by 75% because of the problems with the last major show in that city where the line between heel and face was ambiguous like in WCW, but it resulted in fans being confused and not reacting. They learned and kept everything simple, heel versus face, and got good crowd reactions, and also told Casas and Santo, who have a legendary feud, not to tease dissension in the match, although there was a spot after the match where Casas did turn on Santo, as it would take away from the match. Kiss beat Sueño Chicano in a mask versus mask match underneath, which apparently is leading to Kiss losing his mask later this year to Pierre Roth Jr. in Tijuana. They are having a benefit show in Tijuana on February 22nd for longtime undercard regular Medico Asesino Jr., who lose his house in a recent flood. Casas and Jose Pianono Medina, who were co-handling the booking in EMLL, had a power struggle which has resulted in Pianono basically now having a desk job with little or no power. Morale in EMLL continues to be poor as only Casas and Santo are making good money, and the wrestlers who have been waiting for a major deal between this company and either WWF or WCW are believing that it isn't coming. It doesn't look good in either organization since Paco Alonso and Victor Quiñones, who books the foreign talent for WWF, had a business falling out last year, and WCW doesn't seem to be interested in adding any more Mexican wrestlers to its roster. Felino, who got a tryout on the WWF TV taping on February 16th in Dallas, had told people if he were to get a contract with either WWF or WCW that he would quit EMLL. Funny thing about this is that Felino largely got the tryout through Pantera, and Pantera jumped to EMLL from Azteca largely because with less depth than EMLL, it would be easier to work closer to the top of the shows, and he himself wanted to work a program with Felino. Casas did make a deal with Azteca to bring Damien and Halloween in as regulars, working only the Sunday shows at Arena Coliseo and to work FMW style with the chairs, barbed wire bats and tables, which has never been done in the conservative EMLL. Casas feels he needs something different to get the crowds up, particularly since AAA, with limited talent, has been drawing some good houses using Bloody Bull Terrier, dog collar chain, and cage matches with Heavy Metal vs. Sangre Chicana. Cien Caras is talking seriously about jumping back to AAA. Major Azteca show for this week is February 20th in Tulancingo with Conan and Vampiro and La Parca vs. Silver King and Villano 3 and Jerry Estrada, Salsero and Torero and Super Astro and Super Parca vs. El Brazo and Brazo Cibernetico and Brazo de Platino and Dandy, Super Muñeco and Venom Black and Super Calo and Electra vs. Super Crazy and Mosco de la Merced and Pantera del Ring and El Texano. Mini Damiencito was on the EMLL television show complaining about how he's been treated in various promotions including in EMLL, claiming that Paco Alonso pays no attention to the product and is never around. The belief is that Alonso really must be paying no hands-on attention to allow that interview to play on television. In Azteca, the Oro Jr. vs. Jurassico Mask vs. Mask match is scheduled for March 6th, and they are planning a major show on March 26th in Cuernavaca which will include Venom Black vs. Super Crazy in a Mask vs. Hair match. AAA is debuting yet another Mascara Sagrada, this time called Bad Mascara Sagrada, I guess to feud with Good Mascara Sagrada and even better Mascara Sagrada Jr. feud. Its big show of the past week on February 13th in Nezahualcoyotl had Octagon and Heavy Metal and Latin Lover vs. Fuerza Guerrera and Abismo Negro and Pentagon, Pero Aguayo Jr. and La Parca Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. and Sagrada Jr. vs. Imposter Psicosis and Maniaco and Imposter Mosco de la Merced and Imposter Hysteria. The major EMLL show of the week was February 13th at Arena Coliseo in Atlantis and La Fiera, and Mr. Niebla vs. Apollo Dantes, and El Satanico and Karloff Lagarde Jr. and Pantera and Solar and Olympico vs. Mascara Año 2000 and Violencia, and Rey Bucanero. All Japan. Johnny Ace had a meeting with Paul Heyman last week in Orlando about ECW being involved in the May 1st Tokyo Dome show. Heyman made an offer for his group to come in very inexpensively, and the only thing he wanted out of the deal was for Shane Douglas to be able to defend the title on the show and be put over, and suggested Hiroshi Hase as his opponent since he's a name in Japan, but there would be no political problems, nor would he have a problem doing the job, and that he have the rights to televise the match in the United States, basically as a way to show his champion defending his world title in front of 50,000 fans and going over in a good match. Actually, his plan was to air the match as part of the May 3rd pay-per-view. In exchange, he was willing to bring in as many wrestlers and whomever from his company that All Japan wanted, and they would put over whomever All Japan wanted. Even so, it appears the odds of this taking place aren't good. The new tour opened on February 14th and February 15th with shows at Korakuen Hall. It appears the major focus of the shows were to try out some wrestlers in the undercard for the Dome show, and to get Johnny Ace ready as a credible challenger and get his Cobra Clutch suplex over as a big finisher for Mitsuharu Misawa's Triple Crown on February 28th at Budokan Hall. On the first night, Ace teamed with Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Smith to beat Misawa and Jun Akiyama and Monakia Mossman in 27-38 when Ace pinned Akiyama clean. The next night, Ace and Kobashi beat Steve Williams and Wolf Hockfield, with Ace pinning Hockfield in 18:43. On the first night, Kamikaze and Hiroyoshi Katsubo of Wrestle Dream Factory lost in the opener to All Japan Satoru Asako and Masao Inoue. Apparently they did poorly in the match as well. Gedo and Jado beat Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Yoshinari Ogawa, and Gedo and Jado apparently looked impressive. On February 15th, Gedo and Jado put over Takao Mori and Kentaro Shiga, thereby establishing them in All Japan rings as lower-level talent, while the Battlers team of Muhammad Yone, making his All Japan debut, and Daisuke Ikeda, put over Mossman and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi. Apparently Baba after the show told Kamikaze and Katsubo that he would be giving them another chance to impress him. They liked Gedo and Jado, but told them to modify their style for All Japan rings. No crotch shots. For example, Tatsumi Fujinami had made noises about wanting to wrestle Jumbo Tsuruta at the Dome show, which actually turned into almost a comedy deal since Tsuruta's physical condition has deteriorated in recent years, where he can only do short and frequent stints in the ring since his body was ravaged by hepatitis B. Baba actually commented on that, saying the idea of Fujinami and Tsuruta as a tag team would be interesting. They actually teamed together once on a joint show in 1979 with Mil Mascaras in a six-man, but that the time was past for them to wrestle each other in a single. New Japan President Seiji Sakaguchi also came out and said that the timing was right for that match. February 1st TV show did a 3.9 rating. New Japan. The February 15th Budokan Hall show drew a sellout of 16,000, headlined by a New Japan vs NWO Best of 7 series of matches, which New Japan won 4-3. However, in the final match, Scott Norton pinned IWGP Heavyweight Champion Kensuke Sasaki clean in 9:53 with a powerbomb, which most likely sets up a title match between the two at the April 4th Tokyo Dome show. There at least have been promises made that Norton will get the title in this match, so we'll wait and see. In the other major match, Don Frye did his first job, losing to Naoya Ogawa in 8-12 with a Sankakujin submission, basically a triangle choke with an armlock. After the match, Frye, who is a big-time heel in New Japan, jumped Ogawa and put him in a submission and refused to break, leading to Antonio Inoki doing a run-in for the save and a pull-apart between the two. That angle had the most heat of anything on the show. The best of 7 started with New Japan's Manabu Nakanishi upsetting Hiroyoshi Tenzan in 11-14 with the torture rack submission. Osamu Nishimura pinning NWO Sting in 9:54 with a Northern Lights suplex to make it 2-0. Kurt Hennig made his New Japan debut and had his first match back from knee surgery, beating Satoshi Kojima with a fisherman suplex in 6-12. In a battle of wrestlers who are working on bad knees, NWO made it 2-2 with Keiji Muto using the figure 4 leg lock on Kazuo Yamazaki in 14:50. Shinya Hashimoto then pinned Big Titan with a DDT, and Shiro Koshinaka, representing New Japan on this night, clinched the overall victory, pinning Masahiro Chono in 19:54 after a powerbomb, leading to Norton's win going on last. At the Budokan show, Norio Oniga, 42, announced his retirement effective immediately, and that he would start as a referee on the next tour. New Japan would have a presentation for Oniga on a big show later this year. As mentioned many times, New Japan is attempting to weed out some of the older wrestlers from the roster, and this year offered several of the past 40 guys 3 years at full pay if they agreed to retire this year. Oniga joins Masa Saito and Ref Pete Takahashi in accepting that offer. Oniga debuted as a pro wrestler in 1980 after graduating college. Worked for New Japan from 1980 to 1984 except for a several-month stint in Mexico. then spent a few years working prelims in All Japan before jumping back in 1987. Onaga was a good undercard worker for most of his career. Among his career highlights were 3 reigns as IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion, first beating Jushin Liger in a tournament final on April 29, 1991 in Tokyo and losing to Liger on June 12, 1991, beating Akira Nagami on November 5, 1991 in Tokyo and losing to Liger on February 8, 1992 in Sapporo, and beating Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit, in a tournament final after Liger vacated the title after suffering a broken ankle, with a one-night tourney on September 27, 1994 at Osaka and losing to Koji Kanemoto on February 19, 1995 in Tokyo. He also held the UWA Junior Heavyweight title and won the 1991 Top of the Super Junior tournament, beating Liger in the finals. Norton missed a few dates on the tour with a knee injury. Chono did an angle on the February 13th house show in Gifu involving Akira Hokuto, who is Sasaki's wife and a legendary woman wrestler. Chono attempted to convince Hokuto to be the first woman member of the NWO, but she refused. Chono also announced that no NWO members would be part of the tournament to decide Inoki's final opponent. New Japan still has only announced Fry and Ogawa, as nobody else seems to want to do it, although I understand they may get Kazuo Yamazaki, who has worked with both before, into the thing to put one of them over. On February 9th in Hakodate, there was a surprise in the main event as Sasaki and Hashimoto and Kojima beat Chono and NWO Sting and Tenzan when Kojima pinned Chono. January 31st TV did a 2.9 rating. Other Japan notes. Great Sasuke had a 2-hour-long knee operation this past week. After the surgery, the doctors reported that Sasuke should stay out of action for 1 year, although Sasuke himself is planning on returning in 6 months. Super Delphin will be running shows under the Michinoku Pro Wrestling banner while Sasuke is gone, and this is being played up in the media as a coup d'etat, although my feeling is that aspect of it is largely an angle to feud the two for Sasuke's return, that while he was gone Delphin tried to steal the promotion from him. The confusing situation with the War promotion seems to be that they will be running a show on March 10th at Korakuen Hall, another on April 26th in the same building, and 5 or 6 other spot shows between now and the end of May. All the wrestlers in the promotion with the exception of Genichiro Tenryu and Nobutaka Araya have been fired, but they are going to try and use them on a per show as opposed to a weekly salary deal. Masatomo Takei, the president of the company and Tenryu's brother-in-law, held a press conference on February 11th and Araya was there but Tenryu wasn't. They also announced that Nobukazu Hirai, 28, would be retiring from wrestling because of bad leg injuries. Some notes on the Ring show on February 8th in Amsterdam, Holland. Actually, Willie Peters beat Wataru Sakata on points and it was not a no contest. Apparently the decision was very controversial due to reported inconsistent officiating, so much so that it was reported in Japan it was a no contest. Rings will return to Amsterdam in June. Paul Verlins was actually himself thinking he was going to lose to Dick Frey, and got hammered badly in the first round. He had gone into the fight busted up from a match in Brazil with Nick Nutter, and superglued his cut shut before the fight. But he saw that once the round was over, Frey was totally blown up and he came back in the second round and knocked him out in 1:38 of that round. On the JWP show on February 11th at Korakuen Hall before about 1,450, Hikari Fukuoka and Tomoko Kuzumi regained the JWP tag belts for the company, beating Manami Toyota and Kaoru Ito in 1837 when Fukuoka pinned Toyota after a moonsault. The masked wrestlers in AJW are actually Kaoru Ito and Tomoko Watanabe. The gimmick is already just about dead since they reappeared in the main event on February 15th in Hakata, and Yumiko Hata, who teamed with Takako Inoue as their foes, got on the house mic and said they were Ito and Watanabe. Not that everyone in the crowd hadn't figured it out for themselves since both have distinctive physical features. AJW had a live television show on the Fuji network on February 11th, airing starting at midnight from the Fuji TV studios. The studio only holds 250 people, and there were reportedly 3,000 fans turned away at the door as everyone totally underestimated the interest in doing a live network studio wrestling show, so it was a huge success in that way. Former AJW wrestlers Kyoko Inoue and Toshio Yamada did a 10 minutes draw as the final match on the show. Junzo Hasegawa, the famous wrestling promoter from the 1960s who promoted the Rikidozen Memorial Show and the Umanosuke Ueda Benefit Show, is doing another Ueda Benefit Show in Ueda's hometown of Kumamoto on April 16th. New Japan wrestlers will work the show, as will Tenryu and Yoshiaki Fujiwara. Tokyo was definitely a hotbed of pro wrestling on February 15th. All Japan and New Japan both drew sellouts at Korakuen Hall and Budokan Hall respectively. In addition, LLPW also ran Korakuen Hall drawing about 1,600 and Kyoko Inoue's Neo Ladies promotion ran its second show at Komazawa Olympic Park Gym drawing and announced 3,135 with Inoue putting over JWP champion Hikari Fukuoka in 1918 in the main event. They had been billing at Tsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda against mystery opponents, but about a week before the show when they couldn't get whomever they were after, they turned it into a 4-on-2 elimination match against Chaparita Asari and Yuka Shina and Tiny Mouse and Misai Genkei, which Mita and Shimoda won in 4 straight falls. Atsushi Onita and Koji Nakagawa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda captured FMW's World Street Fight 6-man titles beating Jado and Yukihiro Kanemura and Mr. Ganasuka on February 13th in Chiba when the referee stopped the match ruling Kanemura couldn't continue due to a knee injury in 10:26. Better in bad news, Alan, now 55, captured what was billed as the Canadian title from Shigeo Okamura on February 13th for New Tokyo Pro Wrestling. On the same tour on February 11th in Kanazawa, a tournament for what was billed as the Canadian Tag Team title took place with Adam Copeland and Ken Johnson beating Allen and Jerry Morrow in the finals. Kingdom's next major show will be March 20th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. FMW has bit shows on March 13th in Sapporo and March 29th in Niigata. The April 26th Pancrase pay-per-view will be sold in Japan at a $17 price. The only thing announced for the show thus far is a Masakatsu Funaki title defense on top, and that Jason DeLucia, Guy Mesger, Jason Godzi Semishield, John LeBay and Leon Dyke will appear. It would be LeBay's return after suffering a broken tibia on the December show. Here and there. Buddy Lee, who ran Buddy Lee Attractions, one of the most famous booking offices for country music acts in the country, passed away on February 13th from respiratory failure in Houston where he was undergoing cancer treatment at the age of 65. Lee, who booked such country talent as Willie Nelson, Hank Williams Jr., and Garth Brooks, was a former pro wrestler starting his career in 1950. Within a few years he began promoting musical acts and ran a booking office for women wrestlers, and was largely responsible for making one-time wife Lillian Ellison, Fabulous Moolah, into world champion. Sabu, Rob Van Dam and Mikey Whipwreck worked shows this weekend in London, England, and Hanover, Germany. We don't have a report on the England show other than Whipwreck suffered a serious knee injury on the London show and the main event saw Sabu and Van Dam beat Michael Kovac and Ulf Herman. Sabu lost both his bags coming from London, which included all his wrestling gear, but Ulf Herman's mother sewed a new ring outfit for him, saving his appearance. The show in Hanover, which drew 400 paid, was said to be 70% ECW fans and 30% CWA fans, and it was a hot crowd. Fans raved about the semi where Franz Schumann beat Robbie Brookside. The main was a return match from London ending with Herman and Kovac winning via DQ when Sabu carved up Herman's forehead with scissors. Fans were chanting CWA, CWA as the local faces cleaned house with chairs. Steve Nelson's USWF in Texas is back on March 28th at the Amarillo Fairgrounds Coliseum with a 27-match show headlined by Evan Tanner defending his USWF World Heavyweight title against Rusty Toddy, a 6'6" kickboxer, and Michael Buell defending his lightweight title against David Elizalde. El Hijo del Santo appeared for World Power Wrestling on February 15th in Anaheim, California before 350 fans teaming with Brazo de Plata and Atlantico in the main event beating Misterioso and Poison and Zarco. Actual crowds for Music City Wrestling were 250 in Nashville on January 27th, and 707 paid for almost $6,000 for the Fabulous February reunion on February 7th. Buddy Landel no-showed the February 7th show after informing the promotion about one day ahead that he was going to take a booking closer to home. They also found out at the last minute about Thrasher being injured in St. Louis, so they managed to get King Mabel and the Moondogs as replacements. WWF apologized to the promotion and reimbursed the company for the additional insurance they required them to take out since they were scheduled to use the Headbangers. Ian Rotten's IWA has shows scheduled for Louisville and Lexington this coming week as tributes to Eddie Gilbert, which will include Sid Vicious, in his first matches back since neck surgery, Austin Idol, the Pitbulls, Tom Pritchard, Dutch Mantle, Buddy Landel, Danny Davis, Rip Rogers and Billy Black along with Doug Gilbert headlining. Speaking of Sid, and somebody seems to be just about every week, there were plenty of rumors about him being the replacement for Shawn Michaels on the pay-per-view. Even though there was no foundation in reality, there was at least a viable foundation for the rumors. Sid was scheduled to make his first public appearance on February 15th doing an autograph show in Parsippany, New Jersey for a $1,600 fee. After confirming on February 13th, he called back on February 14th, giving no reason at all, and saying that he wasn't going to be there. When this got out, the assumption was it was a last-minute cancellation because he was being a last-minute replacement, but as it turned out, it was just Sid and his well-established track record. Sid had been adamant all along, and the WWF has been no less adamant about not wanting to return to the WWF, although he has still not been officially released from his contract. Add Dan Severn vs. Franz Schumann of Austria for the NWA title to the Eddie Gilbert Memorial Show on February 28 in Philadelphia. Severn is booked for a shoot match on February 27 in Muncie, Indiana against kickboxer Kevin Rozier. Michigan Wrestling Alliance on March 20th at Troy Athens High School. Warzone Wrestling on March 26th in Atlanta has New Jack, Billy Black and Recon, and as you call 404-633-2770 and mention the Observer, you can get $1 off any ticket. Pennsylvania Championship Wrestling on March 13th in Reading, Pennsylvania. The Cloister has a 30-minute Iron Man match with Cheetah Master vs. Reckless Youth. Northern States Wrestling on March 27th in Westland, Michigan, and Wayne Ford Civic League has Tito Santana vs. Skull Gans plus a promotional war angle with several East Coast indies involved like Reckless Youth, plus Greg Valentine, the Bushwhackers, Buddy Landell, and Madman Pondo. The date for the Jersey All-Pro Wrestling Convention mentioned last week is March 22nd at the Sheraton in Newark, New Jersey. Scheduled to appear at the convention are Steve Austin, Shane Douglas, Al Snow, Paul Heyman, Tommy Dreamer, Pitbulls, Public Enemy, and Dudleys. NHB. A few lineup updates from various shows. The March 1st Shudo main event with the NHB debut of Melvin Douglas, who placed 7th in the 1996 Olympics at 198 pounds, may be on hold as his scheduled opponent Enson Inoue was injured. It now appears that Fabio Gurgel will be replaced by Jerry Bolander in the March 13th UFC in a match against Kevin Jackson. Even though Bolander holds a win over Gurgel and would make an interesting foe for Jackson, the idea of this match is theoretically the winner should face the Frank Shamrock Igor Zinoviev winner in a title match likely in July. However, Shamrock and Bolander are friends, so should both win, it creates a bad situation and it's doubtful that match would take place. But Bolander vs. Jackson is an interesting top-level fight. Kimo has officially signed to fight on the show and the working idea is for his opponent to beat Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Royler Gracie has also been replaced by Vernon White, a former Lions Den and Pancrase fighter, as Kazushi Sakuraba's opponent on the March 15th Pride 2 event with no reason explained. I don't believe Gracie was ever actually signed for the match. They have given up on the idea of doing the May show from Japan. Nippon TV will be broadcasting the March UFC show as a late-night special because of the strong ratings the last show did, and I believe the show is also being broadcast in Brazil. There is talk of doing the summer pay-per-view show from Japan, but that's all in the preliminary stages. There was a political situation as Federico Lapinda, a fight manager, was pushing to get Eugenio Tadeu, Gurgel and Hugo Duarte into the show but wasn't keen on Duarte facing Kosaka. UFC wanted to do business with Lapinda since he also represents Boss Rutten, who John Peretti has very publicly said he wants in the show bad. I'm not sure how this has all gone down as it relates to possibly getting Rutten, but today it was doing the show but working with a different manager, and Gurgel and Duarte are out. Very preliminary plans for the May show would be a triple heavyweight main event, possibly along the lines of Randy Couture vs. Marco Ruiz for the heavyweight title, Mark Coleman vs. Vitor Belfort to determine the next title contender, and the Kimo Kosaka winner against Tank Abbott. New Times of Phoenix Weekly ran a long and very well-balanced article about NHB and a lot about its opposition from local Senator John McCain, who, if you haven't heard, is being very seriously considered as the Republican nominee for the next presidential election, and if he should actually win that election we can probably kiss this sport goodbye, and NHB. The story talked about McCain's large financial interest in Anheuser-Busch, the leading sponsor of pro boxing, vis-a-vis his railing about NHB. In covering McCain's railings against NHB, the article said that again and again, in interviews, McCain has played loose with the facts. He has vastly exaggerated the extent of the violence associated with extreme fighting, and has refused to acknowledge rule changes and safety precautions that make extreme fighting far less dangerous than it was when he first logged his complaints. He also notes that the safety regulations McCain has sponsored in boxing, such as requiring a physician at ringside, are already common practice in NHB events. On his 1996 financial disclosure form, McCain claimed ownership of between $1 million and $5 million in Anheuser-Busch stock along with significant monetary interest in Hensley & Company, an Anheuser-Busch distributor run by his father-in-law. Both companies also donated regularly to McCain's various political election campaigns. Thomas Umstead of Multi-Channel News, who is considered the leading media authority on pay-per-view, said that he couldn't understand why UFC and the like were being singled out for exclusion on pay-per-view where for everyone else, anything goes, and said that the cable company hits on UFC were costing Semaphore Entertainment Group about $1 million per event in lost revenue. And for some more humor on the subject, the state legislature of Hawaii, which recently banned NHB, voted 4-2 on February 17 to legalize cockfighting. The arguments for legalizing a sport, basically for gambling purposes, where roosters are bred to fight often to the bloody death with razor blades attached to their claws. Although the Hawaii bill does mandate wearing protective gloves around the claws rather than razor blades, is because it would create jobs in economically depressed areas. No word on whether the legislature is mandating they fight with rounds and have to fight in a regulation boxing ring. By the way, cockfighting does take place with regularity in McCain state of Arizona as well. ECW, there were no house shows over the past week since Sabu, Rob Van Dam and Mikey Whipwreck were working England and Germany. The May 3rd pay-per-view show called WrestlePalooza 98 will come from the Cobb County Civic Center in Marietta, Georgia. This site is not so much a shot at WCW, and in fact, we are told that ECW will never mention its proximity to WCW headquarters in hyping the show, as much as it being the day before the start of a major cable TV convention as they want to try and get some execs to come around and see the atmosphere at the show. This would be a good show then not to carve up anyone's forehead. The August 2nd pay-per-view is scheduled to come from Indianapolis. There is nothing really new on the March 1st pay-per-view show. Paul Heyman is looking at putting Sabu and Van Dam against either Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki from FMW or New Jack and John Kronus. The pluses are that the Hayabusa and Shinzaki bout could be a great high-flying match and would theoretically be the better actual match of the two, but the New Jack and Kronus match would mean more because the wrestlers are over with the promotion. Plus it doesn't require having to work through FMW to get wrestlers with only a few weeks lead time. At the same time, there is some pressure on ECW to put on a good show this time. The report here that Just Incredible vs. Great Sasuke would be on May 3rd is incorrect. It'll more likely be Credible vs. Mikey Whipwreck, depending upon the extent of Whipwreck's knee injury in England. Sasuke won't be back in the ring until August at the earliest. February 21st at ECW Arena will be Shane Douglas and Bam Bam Bigelow vs. Sabu and Van Dam, Tommy Dreamer vs. Credible in a first blood match, Taz vs. Brackus in Brackus last night in and Chris Condito vs. Lance Storm. Heyman is toying with the idea, depending on how well it plays, of doing house shows where Condito and Storm wrestle each other on the undercard, and then form a tag team defending their titles later in the show. Heyman is also trying to put together a deal as if FMW for 6 people, likely being Douglas, Francine, Taz, Dreamer, Beulah and one more going to FMW in late April. Again, Heyman wants to get Dreamer to defend the title on an FMW show and use the footage in the United States on his TV. WCW. To say the behind the scenes is tumultuous would be an everyday thing, but the situation has become far more extreme than usual. It is impossible to have 100 wrestlers under contract and keep them all happy under any circumstances. It's even harder here because the most talented wrestlers are used in the middle and the top slots are locked up by people who have the name power and connections, and there is little upward mobility unless one of the stars brings you up to their level, as Hall, Nash and Savage did with Page, and Page is now doing with Raven and perhaps Benoit. And even worse when many of these talented wrestlers have been main eventers and big drawing cards elsewhere in their career. After being kept off TV for a few weeks with the idea he was going to be brought back with a major angle, Ric Flair returned proving he may not be the best worker in the business, but he's still the only one with the key to having a good match with Lex Luger on February 12th in Oklahoma City. The so-called Big Angle took place on the February 16th Nitro in Tampa, which turned out to be a really lame angle where he saved Bret Hart from the NWO and the two shook hands. Lame because the crowd didn't care as the angle was flattened by the debut of Bryan Adams, who nobody knew, and if they did they'd care even less, or cared about turning on Hart, and desperately needed a Flair and Hart interview to explain why they were feuding a few weeks ago and now Flair saved him. Although there is basically little or no chance of Flair leaving, and to the best of our knowledge he has not signed his contract although he is working under a new 3-year deal with a substantial raise, Flair himself has brought up to Bischoff and at least one other, maybe more, in management the idea of retiring and working for the company in a PR fashion, going to ticket sale openings, etc. Flair is acknowledged within both WWF and WCW as the single best advanced man in the game because he shows up looking like a star, has the superstar name aura, and he interacts tremendously with the media, particularly local radio sports talk types, because he has a character but doesn't come off full of himself and a jerk like a lot of celebrities tend to, and has good knowledge of other sports so can relate to the hosts even if they aren't wrestling fans. It isn't so much that he wants to retire from the ring as much as frustration about believing he's only being used to put others over, and too many forces are constantly at work, and those forces are also constantly frustrated, failing, trying to keep him from getting over. I don't anticipate that happening either, although in hindsight cutting off the legs of the Hart feud given the interviews, the buy rate it drew and the quality of the pay-per-view match, seems to boggle the mind. Anyway, that's hardly the big story. Hulk Hogan, who to the best of our knowledge has also not signed, is playing his power up for all it's worth, which is what someone in power should do. While Hogan has always been the focal point of the promotion, he's now booking his TV angles to where there are a million angles on TV, but none of them mean anything and the announcers really don't emphasize any of them except his program with his shadow, Randy Savage, and starting the tease for an eventual program with Bret Hart. Sting, Lex Luger, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash, Hart and Ric Flair's programs all pale in comparison. The fact Hogan already has the biggest name, yet he gets so much television time not only live, but they replay all his interviews to death, give him video features, and the announcers basically talk about his angles and nobody else's. It's just incredibly smart usage of leverage. A few months ago, if Hogan left, it would hurt of course, but WCW would still be doing big ratings and sellouts every night without him. In the past, when Hogan would leave for a few weeks, there was no difference in the ratings. They still may draw sellouts on the road if he left, since they draw great whether he's booked on the house shows or not. But he's positioned things where him not being around would leave a giant hole in the company, and one would think it would make a difference with the ratings. And that's not the big story either. For all the reasons anyone can imagine, most of the mid-card talent is unhappy, but now so more than ever. Eddie Guerrero actually went to Eric Bischoff trying to get a release from his contract but was turned down and actually snapped at, although Bischoff did later apologize. However, with the exception of Rey Mysterio Jr. and maybe one other wrestler who I don't believe has actually signed his new deal, virtually all the wrestlers are under contract for nearly 2 more years, and it's doubtful Bischoff would release them since most would wind up with Titan Sports. None of the Mexicans have been happy for all the reasons everyone would figure, but an added reason is that, at least as is planned, Juventud Guerrera is supposed to lose his mask to Chris Jericho on February 22nd at the Cow Palace. There were a lot of problems in October leading up to Halloween Havoc when the plan was for Mysterio Jr. to lose his mask to Eddie Guerrero, which ended up not happening when Bischoff had a change of heart after a lot of pleading by Mysterio Jr. 30 minutes before the show. Apparently Guerrero wasn't happy about losing it, being that it's a family heirloom and that his father has wrestled for more than 20 years and never lost his similar mask. You know, all the stuff that Mike Tenay says on television is actually a shoot, but had agreed to do so, being led to believe they'd build it up right for a few months and him getting a major focused push and a decent length title reign before dropping it, so it would mean something when it happened. Perhaps in a mask versus hair match with Jericho, since Jericho's hair would create a lot of interest as well. It would also give time for him to work a simultaneous program in Mexico where he'd lose the mask there, where it would be a huge news story. Well, he figured wrong as he showed up at Nitro on February 9th to find out he was supposed to lose his mask on February 22nd and felt double-crossed. His big promised push wound up being a loss to Kidman, a win over Dandy, and the angle with Jericho, and that's all, folks. There are forces supposedly trying to get the SF finish changed, but the odds of that happening seem far lower than 1 week before the Mysterio Jr. match with Guerrero, but the feeling is that WCW doesn't understand, and worse, doesn't respect, Mexican wrestling traditions and the Mexican talent themselves. Not to mention that there seems to always be heat with Conan, the latest being over him missing 3 house shows in Texas because of a neck injury from taking those Scott Steiner SSDs on every television show, since most of the top guys are unwilling to take the move. Things got even worse on February 16th. The Malenko-Guerrero-Benoit group feel that no matter how hard they work and how much crowd heat they get, there is no upward mobility. The resentment of, after being told for so long to be patient and wait their turn, then seeing Bryan Adams show up and on his first day, immediately get into an angle involving Bret Hart and the NWO, combined with having wrestlers who just arrived and, even though they are talented, are getting no heat, being put over them either on television or on road shows and being put in higher profile angles. Malenko went to Bischoff this past week asking about the Cruiserweight tournament, which they shelved a few months back, and saying that he didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel and wanted to know what, if any, future plans there were for him, and Bischoff told him that he and the others were great workers but that they don't put asses in the seats, which, when word got around, made a lot of people hot because they have elsewhere and never have gotten the chance in WCW to be positioned to do so. Internally, This has all become almost a confirmation of the long-said proviso that the only way to get a top spot in WCW is to first go to the WWF and be made a star there, and then WCW will make you a main eventer, stealing you back. Nitro on February 16th in Tampa, Florida drew a sellout 4,000 to the state fairgrounds. The show was basically a favor for George Steinbrenner, so the card was part of the fair. No ratings are available at press time due to President's Day, but all expectations were that it would set the all-time record. Hogan and Bischoff started the show with Hogan saying he was going to back Nick Patrick. The plan is for Patrick to ref in San Francisco, which most likely would lead to Hogan regaining the title. The Ultimate Goldberg pinned Hugh Morris in 55 with a jackhammer. Sick Boy pinned Mark Starr in 325 with a pedigree. Sick Boy usually shows a lot of potential, but this wasn't good. Public Enemy beat Kevin Nash and Scott Hall via DQ in 319 when Nash powerbombed Rocco Rock over the top rope and through a table that Johnny Grunge had passed out on. Nash was then arrested and tried to lead the crowd in chanting Attica, Attica, which they didn't get yet, but probably will in another week or two. Nick Patrick did a funny interview claiming it was all a right-wing conspiracy against him. Mike Enos pinned Barry Horowitz with a power slam in 147. Horowitz looked bad. They did one of the lamest angles on record. They said there was trouble in the back, but when we get back there, actually this was all taped. Davey Boy Smith was walking around sipping coffee. I can't believe Nash allowed him to steal his coffee sipping gimmick. Then Steve McMichael showed up and claimed it was a right-wing conspiracy, whoops, and they were pulled apart. Yuji Nagata beat La Parka in 334 when Disco Inferno ran in and used the stunner on Parka. Ultimo Dragon beat Billy Kidman in 652 with the Dragon Sleeper. Real good. Dragon was even better than usual and Kidman was good as well. Page was being interviewed and said that on Thursday it would be he and Benoit versus Raven and Saturn. He then challenged Raven to a match then and there, and Raven and Saturn both got in the ring, but Benoit came out to even the sides and it broke up quickly. Barbarian pinned Meng in 218 after 4 high kicks. Jimmy Hart is now managing Barbarian, so I guess that makes Meng the face. Hart broke one of those WCW breakable chairs on Meng once, who didn't sell it. Then Hart did something really smart. He tried to hit Meng again with the portion of the chair with the hole in it. Luckily he didn't sell that one either. Saturn was supposed to wrestle Disco, but Parka attacked Disco in the aisle and cracked him several times with a chair. Rick Martel then took Disco's place and the flock kept interfering, leading to Saturn making him tap out to the rings in 315. Kurt Hennig pinned Bobby Eaton with a fisherman suplex in 245. Boy, that match would have been great 10 years ago. Rick Rude is Hennig's second and he hasn't been around since Hennig has been out with the knee injury. Hennig flew in from a match in Japan the previous day, and if he wasn't exhausted, he isn't human. Steiners beat Marcus Bagwell and Scott Norton via DQ in 517 when Vince and Conan interfered. Ted DiBiase actually took a bump from Vince this time. Norton had wrestled in Tokyo the previous day and it showed. They've got how many wrestlers under contract and they need to put 2 guys in the ring, having flown from Tokyo to Tampa. Martel then won the TV title from Booker T when, you guessed it, Saturn interfered and Booker went after him but injured his knee in the process in 8 minutes. Booker is far from the best worker in the company, but he's got headliner potential because he's got a few really cool moves and a lot of potential. Martel is a really good worker and tries hard, not to mention being in incredible condition for his age, but is just from the wrong era with the wrong style. He's agile, but not on the level of today's agile wrestlers, and is really having problems getting over. Then came the Brett angle. He cut a promo on Hogan. Brian Crush Adams showed up and said he'd watch his back, then turned on him. The NWO attacked and Flair made the save, and they shook hands. J.J. Dillon announced that at Super Brawl that Martel would defend the title against Booker, and the winner would on the same show defend against Saturn. Martel acted like he wasn't happy. Benoit and Dean Malenko beat Chris Jericho and Eddie Guerrero in 617 when Malenko made Jericho tap to the cloverleaf. An awesome match. Guerrero put on a Shawn Michaels performance. Actually, he may be even better now because he does it more often and because he can work any style and can do it on the mat as well as fly, take bumps, do lucha, Japanese or American style. Michaels really is mainly the flying moves and the great bumps. Finally, Sting and Luger, who were basically cast as bit players working around Hogan and Savage as the stars, beat them in 430 when Sting had the Scorpion on Hogan and the NWO interfered. Hart and Flair made the save and were left in the ring at the end with Sting and Luger. After all the talk of Hart and Hogan hating each other during the show, at the end, Hart did almost all his spots with Hennig and never even teased a confrontation with Hogan. Granted, it is too soon for them to even touch, but not too soon to tease. Besides the 2 different TV title matches, Also added to the February 22nd Cow Palace pay-per-view are Steve McMichael vs. British Bulldog and La Parka vs. Disco Inferno. Thunder on February 11th in Oklahoma City drew the first sellout at the Myriad Center since Bill Watts and Junkyard Dog, Under a Mask as Stagger Lee, fought Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton in 1984. It was 11,955, 11,088 paying $225,130 and another $114,205 in merchandise. Show drew a 3.7 rating, 3.6 first hour, 3.8 seconds hour, and 5.7 share. Show opened with Hogan challenging Hart and Savage. They announced the tag for Nitro and Savage came out. Hogan teased like he was going to apologize to Savage but reversed his field. Then Savage teased he was going to apologize and decked Hogan. Next up was This Week in Motorsports, aka Time to Make a Sandwich. I have a rating suggestion. The next sport WCW should sponsor and feature in brief clips should be a women's beach volleyball team. Kidman pinned Prince Iaukea in 5:22 with a shooting star. Both worked hard and it was good in spots but it was missing something, and had real good near falls. Raven and Riggs were hanging backstage when Mortis showed up. Apparently Mortis wanted to join the flock but since he doesn't speak, it was that Raven telepathy that figured it out. Actually Mortis with that mask making those faces reminded me of my dog at about the same point wanting me to switch stations after watching 400 hours of wrestling every week. They told Mortis he had to beat Page to join the flock. Meng beat Morris with the death grip in 3:12. Real bad. After the match, Barbarian tried to calm down Meng who wouldn't break the hold, so Meng put the grip on Barbarian. Page beat Mortis in 3:47 with the Diamond Cutter. Great TV match and great heat. The flock carried Mortis out with them and Raven gave him a DDT on the ramp. McMichael beat Jim Neidhart via DQ in 1:46. Actually this feud is so bad it's really entertaining. In this installment, McMichael picked up the ring steps. The idea is that Bulldog was to run in and attack him so save Neidhart. Anyway, poor Mongo, he's holding these ring steps, he's not allowed to throw them on Neidhart. Neidhart gets up and gets in the ring, and Mongo is still holding the steps with no clue what to do since Bulldog still hadn't gotten there. Finally Bulldog showed up for their requisite brawl. Bagwell pinned Chris Adams with the Buff Blockbuster in 4:36. Okay. Jericho kept the Cruiser title beating Chavo Jr. in 3:07 with the Crab. Good TV bout. Bulldog pinned Sick Boy in 3:07 with the Power Slam. Benoit beat Raven via DQ when the flock interfered in 2:43. Please don't bring up that Raven's matches are under Raven's rules and that means no DQ. Really fun while it lasted. Raven is so much better than I thought he was last year. Either that or Benoit is so much better than Sandman. They were killing Benoit until Page made the save. Benoit told Page he didn't want his help and didn't need his help, but Page told Benoit that he really did need his help. No doubt the latter statement is true. Goldberg destroyed Glacier in 1:05. Finally Luger beat Flair via DQ in 5:46 when Luger had Flair's figure 4 reversed and Savage attacked Luger. Savage also attacked Flair, but then Hogan attacked Savage. The NWO showed up, then Sting arrived. Sting, Luger, Hogan and Savage brawled to the back while Flair gave all the NWO guys low blows in the ring. Tickets for a house show on March 28th in Auburn Hills, Michigan, one of the Hogan-Sting cage matches, and Nitro March 30th in Chicago were put on sale and first day ticket sales were $9,175 and $192,324 in the former and $12,558 and $222,000 in the latter. Tickets for March 5th Thunder in Columbus, Ohio sold out in a few hours. The beat goes on. Glacier is now feuding with Chris Adams over who stole whose finisher. Gene Okerlund missed Nitro on February 9th due to a mild case of pneumonia but is already back. There will be a triple main on April 2nd house show in Tampa with Hogan vs. Sting Cage, Hart vs. Savage and Hennig vs. Flair. Weekend house shows were February 13th in Springfield, Missouri which sold out with 2,898 paying $71,480 and February 14th in Kansas City, Kansas with 2,905 paying $60,475. Top bouts both nights were Luger vs. Hall, Benoit vs. Saturn and Page vs. Bagwell. In Kansas City, Harley Race showed up and got a huge pop for a run-in. Luger was wrestling Hall in the main and after a ref bump, Bagwell gave Hall knucks, which he used for the pin. Race, with short blonde hair reminiscent of his late 60s look as handsome Harley Race teaming with pretty boy Larry Hennig, did a run-in and got the knucks and showed the ref who restarted things. Race then cleaned house on Bagwell, and decked Hall allowing Luger to cradle Hall. It's funny. Race worked that building on and off for maybe 30 years, and he was never as over when he was supposed to be the top star as he is when he shows up now. WWF. Raw is War/Shotgun tapings for February 21st took place on February 16th at Reunion Arena in Dallas before a sellout crowd of 13,296 paying $201,827, another $120,523 in merchandise. It was the first sellout for pro wrestling in that building since Christmas. Christmas of 1983, that is. Ric Flair vs. David Von Erich was the main event that night. Show opened with a tryout match as John Cena pinned Mike Davis with the old earthquake splash. Cena has lost a lot of weight. Quebecers beat LOD via core. The Outlaws came out and threw Hawk in a dumpster and sat on the lid. Animal then chased the Outlaws off the lid with a chair, letting Hawk get out. They brawled to the back with the Outlaws. Said to be crummy. Ken Shamrock beat Sniper with the ankle lock. Jackal yelled at Sniper and slapped him in the face and turned his back on him. Sniper did shove Jackal. Jerry Lawler interviewed Mark Marrow and Sable. It was bound to happen as fans tried to start a show your tits chant. Marrow was yelling at Sable for wearing an Austin t-shirt. Anyway, someone came out and brought Sable flowers. Marrow started yelling at her and she walked out on him with the flowers. Jim Cornette did an interview saying the NWA was better than the WWF and introduced Tommy Young as the official NWA ref. Young retired from refereeing many years ago when he suffered a neck injury taking a bump and was told he was risking paralysis if he took the wrong bump. My feeling is that Young is doing the gig with the proviso that he doesn't take any bumps. Then Rock and Rolls defended the NWA tag titles against Head Bangers. Good match. Just as Young was about to count the pin on Ricky Morton, he saw the other banger throw Robert Gibson over the top rope and called for the DQ because it was under NWA rules. Farouk was then to wrestle Steve Blackman. Before the match, Rocky Maivia gave the other Nation of Domination members presents. He gave Kama, D-Lo and Mark Henry Rolex watches. He then gave Farouk a wrapped gift, which was a life-size poster of Rocky with the belt. Farouk got mad and threw the poster down, but Rocky ran after it. During the match, Rocky was holding up the poster of himself when Farouk tried to grab it to use as a foreign object. Boy, that would be a killer foreign object to use. Maivia grabbed the poster away, and while Farouk was distracted, Blackman pinned him. Farouk got mad after the match and tore up the poster. This angle was said to have been entertaining. Jim Ross interviewed Steve Austin and they claimed DX wasn't there because they were contemplating legal action for what Austin did to China on the pay-per-view. Actually, Michaels was continued from page 14. Injured and not there, and Triple H was there but he re-injured his knee and I guess they didn't want him to come out limping. Owen Hart retained the European title beating Jeff Jarrett via DQ when Cornette interfered, but Hart put him in the sharpshooter as well. Said to be by far the best match on the show. Ross then introduced Doak Hendricks as Michael P.S. Hayes of the Fabulous Freebirds, and he came out to the song Bad Street USA. The lights went out and Kane came out. Hayes took off his boot and clocked Kane with it twice, but Kane no-sold, and choke-slammed and tombstoned him and Paul Bearer kicked away at his carcass. Taka Michinoku and Aguila beat Brian Christopher and Pirata Morgan, getting a tryout, when Taka pinned Morgan. Said to be a good match. Christopher walked out on Morgan after the match. Morgan, who is 38, was a great worker 10 to 15 years ago. Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie beat Goldust and Marrow when Charlie pinned Goldust after Jack hit him with a chair. Goldust was in his old ring outfit. Sable came out to argue with Marrow and Luna tore up her flowers. For Shotgun, Cornette came out, and being the pro he is, limped all the way to the set selling the sharpshooter Hart gave him earlier in the show. Pantera beat someone in what I was told was a really good high-flying match, but at this point in the card nobody cared about it. I believe from the description that it was Felino, as the person was said to be real good with a tiger mask-like costume, although it also may have been Shiryu, since at one point he was scheduled for a tryout on this card. WCW is also after Shiryu right now. Kurgan beat local wrestler Said Man. Said to be horrible. Said Man got a bloody nose from a stiff kick. DOA beat Sabio and Jesus and Jose via DQ when Miguel Perez interfered. Christopher beat Tony Williams. For a trivia note, these two started wrestling together as teenagers in USWA as the New Kids tag team. Mark Henry and D-Lo beat Bill Irwin and Ken Herzog, and Barry Windham pinned Tom Brandy with Young as NWA ref. Bradshaw challenged Windham to a match and attacked him after the match. Dark match main event saw Austin and LOD beat Maivia and Outlaws when Austin used the stunner on Maivia. They were confiscating signs at the door, mainly for lewdness. although some that made it past the censors were Rock Has No Cock, I Saw Sable's Breasts, Sable 38:D, and Bring Back Brett. Although she didn't work, Jacques Moore, Jacqueline aka Miss Texas, was at the show, so she'll probably be getting a shot, although you'd think if Marlena comes back that they already have too many women running around to begin with. Ken Taylor and Red Bastion, who are promoting a new group called NWA Southwest Championship Wrestling starting in Dallas on February 27th, where they're talking to Cornette about using the NWA wrestlers in the WWF. The judge handling the Jim Hellwig v. Titan Sports lawsuit made a preliminary ruling that Hellwig is allowed to use the name Warrior and all characteristics and likenesses of the Ultimate Warrior character in any marketing ventures. The judge did not make a ruling regarding Ultimate Warrior. The name was a small part of a yet-to-be-heard lawsuit of Hellwig for breach of contract, and for his claim that WWF used the term Always Believe as a WWF marketing catchphrase at the 1996 licensing show, a phrase which he claimed as his own intellectual property. Hellwig had used that phrase in his comic book prior to WWF using it. As for the character itself, Hellwig was doing basically the exact same character in Dallas as Dingo Warrior before going to WWF and having the name changed to Ultimate Warrior, so he should maintain rights to that identity. The breach aspect revolves around his leaving WWF in the summer of 1996. He missed 3 house shows after an argument with Vince McMahon. Titan had claimed he demanded McMahon a huge number of his comic books per month and McMahon refused and he stopped showing up. Hellwig claimed that he missed the shows because his father was ill and dying. As it turned out, his father, who he was never close to, did die 2 days later, although nobody at Titan was aware of it until a day or two after that. Titan would only allow Hellwig to return if he would post, as a shoot, it was also explained on television this way, a $250,000 bond which he would forfeit on his first unexplained absence from work, which he refused, and never returned. For all the talk about Bret Hart, who was working main events nightly, being overpaid by company standards, Hellwig's contract when he returned in 1996 was for nearly as much money, $1.2 million per year, and he was programmed as mainly a mid-card attraction. Apparently this past June, when WCW was teasing a mystery superstar, which was originally supposed to be Mike Tyson and Kurt Hennig, but Tyson bit Evander's ear and so it was Hennig and Raven, to debut on a Nitro, WWF reacted to the internet rumors it was Hellwig, so Linda McMahon wrote a letter and phoned Hellwig saying it would be tragic if Ultimate Warrior wrestled for anyone else and told him they wanted him back where he belongs. Vince called as well. They then attempted to get a restraining order to keep Hellwig from going to WCW, where he was never going in the first place. The order was denied, and as Titan went to appeal, the guy turned out to be Hennig. Hellwig posted a long post on the internet explaining his winning of the right to the Warrior name and its indicia, trade dress, characteristics, and body mannerisms. John Randall of the Minnesota Vikings is going to be in Austin's corner against Helmsley on March 1st in St. Paul. WWF closed a deal to get on network television in Australia. The latest NWA angle will be the revival of the new Midnight Express tag team. I believe it'll be Bob Holly and Bart Gunn, although it may be Adam Copeland and Sean Morley. If you think about it, even though this NWA angle is dying to the masses, the longer it lasts, it is kind of funny if you consider it like the Brady Bunch movie. Then again, sometimes the Observer hotline is like that too. WWF has several wrestlers booked for Mad TV the night before WrestleMania, and there is talk the entire show will have a WWF wrestling theme. Vince McMahon is scheduled on the TSN show Off the Record on February 23rd and February 24th. A Lawler joke that wasn't funny. In reference to Bill Clinton, he said, "Where's Lee Harvey Oswald when you need him?" Scott Putski's contract has expired and wasn't renewed. Vader isn't expected back after eye surgery until after Mania. Solofa Fatu Sultan has either been released from his contract or it ran out and he wasn't renewed. Weekend house show saw February 12th in Miami draw $5,730 and $102,132. February 13th in West Palm Beach drew a sellout $5,281 and $83,912, and February 14th in Tampa drew $6,897 and $113,108, which was 2 days before WCW was in the same city for Nitro. Merchandise for the 3 shows was $156,688 or $8.75 per. Thrasher had 8 stitches from his cut on the pay-per-view. The March 2nd Cleveland Raw is going to have to be a hot show since one would think they'll have to bring back Undertaker, plus have Tyson and Michaels. The readers' pages. Tyson. It's amazing the amount of coverage the Tyson WWF deal is getting in New York. Ever since the Raw angle, the New York Daily News has printed countless articles, most of them not really downgrading but just reporting what is there. The day after the press conference there were 3 articles and none of the 3 were negative. What would you expect from a newspaper that regularly includes a pro wrestling column and posts the Nitro and Raw results every Wednesday? As far as the New York Post is concerned, practically every article has been negative, especially those coming from Wallace Matthews and Phil Mushnick. Steve Austin and to a lesser extent Shawn Michaels' pictures have been plastered over every newspaper in every major city. Not even Lawrence Taylor or Dennis Rodman created this type of hoopla. Jim Caldwell. Saratoga Springs, New York. DiBiase. I just finished reading Ted DiBiase's autobiography and found it quite good. He didn't expose the business, but he also didn't assume all his readers were marks. There was a surprisingly good balance there. He did mention an ex-military family friend named Robert Lincoln. I was in the service during that period and knew someone with that name. If Ted's friend was a skinny dude from Alaska, it would be the same person. Ted's closeness with his stepfather, Iron Mike, was heartwarming. I watched Mike wrestle in the 60s and he did a good job of pretending to be a bad guy. Ted also mentioned wrestling in the old circuits and coming through Albuquerque when he wrestled out of Amarillo. I remember seeing him wrestle solo and as a tag team partner with Mercedes Solis, who went on to become Tito Santana. Of the thousands of matches I've watched over the years, a few stand out in my mind as being memorable. One such match took place in Albuquerque 20 years ago between Ted DiBiase and Adrian Adonis. Adonis was one of the most nimble men of his size in the business. It was a street fight match and quite entertaining. I also remember a match between then world champion Harley Race and Ted which was also quite good. Ted got lucky getting the $1 Million Man gimmick in the WWF. Other wrestlers got far less favorable and some got downright stupid gimmicks like Terry Taylor and the Stupid Chicken Routine and Adrian Adonis with a gay gimmick. Ted's bout with alcohol and subsequent fall from grace was excellently portrayed and his reaffirmation with the Lord was very touching. I have had similar experiences in my life with similar results and I can understand Ted's love of Jesus very well. Dick Fagerlund. Rio Rancho, New Mexico. I just finished reading Ted DiBiase's autobiography and highly recommend it. I was confused by a couple of things in the very beginning of the book which I'm sure are factual errors. He talks about the match on NBC's Main Event when Hogan wrestled Andre with the twin Heckner refs when Andre captured the belt and turned it over to him. DiBiase refers to the day as a crisp autumn Saturday afternoon. Wasn't this show on Friday Night Live during primetime in February? Is it even possible to use the phrase exposing the business anymore? Vince McMahon got on his own television and all but admitted match outcomes are predetermined. WCW puts belts on people at TV tapings before they actually win the belts. This phrase has become passé. I read an interview with Greg Valentine where he had some unkind things to say about you because he said you expose the business. I thought that phrase was ironic considering he gave the interview to a newsletter. His boss is Eric Bischoff, who along with Hulk Hogan he had high praise for. Nobody has exposed the business more than Hogan and Bischoff in modern times. Stephen Muller. La Crosse, Wisconsin. Response from Dave Meltzer. The Andre Hogan match in question was aired live on February 5, 1988 from Indianapolis on a Friday night NBC primetime special which was, and still is the single most watched television wrestling event in history, drawing a 15.2 rating and reaching 33 million viewers. For comparison, the combined television audience of the most watched quarter hour in the history of Monday Night Wrestling is probably between 9 and 10 million, which shows the exposure difference between the boom period of 10 years ago when WWF was on network television and high cable ratings for both groups combined today. Thunder. Although the ratings have been good, I've been very disappointed so far with Thunder. It comes off to me as nothing more than a live version of WCW Saturday Night. We get 2 hours of Lee Marshall instead of Dusty Rhodes, but is that even a gain? I was hoping for more of an emphasis on the cruiserweights, but I think Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko have been on once, and on February 5th, La Parka lost to Hugh Morris and Juventud Guerrero lost to Billy Kidman. The live crowds die fast when they realize that the big shots aren't going to wrestle. Davey Boy Smith has gotten no pop so far, and who was the genius that decided to book a program with him and Steve McMichael? I will admit Bill Goldberg isn't the most talented wrestler. However, his short squash matches have been good and keeping his matches short hide his weaknesses. He's over more than Ken Shamrock and at a much cheaper price. It's a shame to see how Saturn has turned out. I've been a big fan of his for a long time, but his matches put the crowd to sleep faster than a late-night infomercial. It's not like WCW hasn't tried to push him, but I'm afraid the knee injury has really limited his mobility. I hope Taz has been watching. Saturn's matches have the same suplexes with no crowd reaction. I'm afraid Taz would encounter the same if he went to WCW or WWF. It used to be the NWA that was on the short end financially and pushing the button on language and violence. The WWF had all the money and wouldn't think of using blood or swearing on television. An early vote for most disgusting promotional tactic goes to the angle where the New Age Outlaws pushed the dumpster off the ramp. They tried to make it out like Terry Funk and Cactus Jack were dead, and for them to come out 1 hour later came off as being really lame. I feel bad for Jeff Jarrett. He has talent. Unfortunately for him, his talent would have fit in great 10 years ago as his style of wrestling doesn't cut it these days. I'm surprised at ECW's success in pay-per-view. Each show has gotten worse, but if a large number of people are willing to pay for the crap they are putting on now, think of how many would have done so when ECW had Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Scorpio, Raven, Cactus Jack and others. Their television the last couple of weeks has been their worst ever. The same matches and the same feuds every week. Paul Heyman has always surprised me. Just when I'm ready to give up on them, they do something that gives them life, but I can't see it this time. Wesley Jones. Chesapeake, Virginia. Awards. As usual, the awards generally made sense with only a few exceptions. Cactus Jack as Best Brawler was a case of a worker living off his reputation. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Chris Benoit, Kevin Sullivan, Randy Savage, Tommy Dreamer, Rob Van Dam, Sabu and Sandman were all superior brawlers. Hulk Hogan as Worst Wrestler. We all know he sucks, but he's not the worst as long as Ahmed Johnson, Jim Duggan, Crush and Steve McMichael are around. Conspicuous by its absence in the best major card was the Great American Bash. It was similar to the recent and excellent Sold Out, solid booking and some good to great matches. Ian Goodwin. Brooklyn, New York. Announcing. I had the privilege to attend both WCW Nitro from the Superdome in New Orleans and the recent Saturday night tapings in Thibodaux, and had a great time. If you've never witnessed a Nitro taping live, you don't know what you are missing. But if I had to choose between watching it on television or going, I'd stay home for the front row entertainment. We had decent seats for Nitro and fourth row for the tapings on Tuesday. I noticed some omissions in the report on the show in the February 2nd Observer. Bill Goldberg be Joe Malenko, Dean's brother, Jim Neidhart be Wayne Bloom, Mike Enos and Bloom be Disorderly Conduct, John Norby Evan Courageous and Eddie Guerrero be Len Denton. There were 20 matches that night. Where do Tony Schiavone and Scott Hudson come up with their attendance numbers? Schiavone said there were 25,000 at Nitro and Hudson said there were 12,000 on Saturday night. Adam Pennison. Montague, Louisiana. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. February 23, 1998.